The New York Times coverage of the recent Nairobi hotel terror attack sparked a debate over the use of graphic pictures of the dead. Victims were shown slumped at tables where they'd been killed. It's not the first time the media has been criticised for its choice of photos and video, and critics say it's often black victims rather than white who feature. Is this true? And are there enough regulations around what's posted on social media? Hello there, welcome to Roundtable. I'm Shuli Ghosh. Images play a powerful role in how we see the world. But is it necessary for media to run images of the dead and injured? Do they tell the story or do they dehumanize the victims? And who decides what's too distressing to publish or too important to ignore?
They have the power to shock and horrify and go viral online. For some viewers and audiences, graphic and violent news images can play a part in shaping their views and perspective. The New York Times coverage of the Nairobi terror attack sparked a debate on how Western media depicts death when it comes to non-white victims. Critics argued it was unnecessary to run images of the deceased, while others said not doing so would shield viewers from reality. The lack of context and regulation on social media adds a new layer to the ethics debate. But whether it's a terror attack in Kenya, images of refugees who have lost their lives, or scenes of violence in the US, how should newsrooms handle violent and graphic images, and where should they draw the line?
Lot to talk about. Let's introduce today's guests. Joining us in Seattle is Chanju Mwanza, freelance journalist. In Pennsylvania is Jessica Fishman, author of Death Makes the News. In the studio with me is Paddy Dowling, humanitarian photojournalist, and Barry Turner, senior lecturer in journalism at Lincoln University. Welcome to all my guests today. Paddy, let me start with you because you're behind the lens on a lot of these kind of photos. When you are taking photos of distressing events, what are your primary concerns?
The primary concern for me always is to capture what's happening. It is not my job as a photojournalist to censor what's happening in front of my eyes. But also I always tend to wear two hats. I work for INGOs around the world. I also write and photograph for the Independent newspaper in London. So there are always two different briefs that I have. One for the INGO is to always try and restore some dignity to the person that's in distress. And for the paper is to always report the truth and let the reader decide for themselves what they think about that.
Do you worry that you might be criticised if the pictures are seen as too graphic, or alternatively criticised if you're seen to be sanitising the story?
I try not to think too much about it, Shuli. I think if you look at history, this is not the first time that images of graphic nature have been shown. Look back at the Battle of Waterloo or Goya's shooting of the 3rd of March. These are paintings where artists, before the camera, felt it was necessary to document these things. In modern day, after the camera, look at the greats like Don McCullum. He's a real inspiration for me, and the reason I'm a photojournalist today. He felt compelled to put himself in harm's way to document the truth, what was happening in front of him. It's our job to hold the world to account, not to sanitize the media at source.
Barry, I mean, I know you look at ethics a lot. Is there a concern over just how graphic a picture should be and whether how it impacts on an audience?
Well, there's something of a tug of war because you are between the position where you are portraying reality and truth in all its graphic detail, and the concept that you may shock or disturb people. There's certainly no single set of rules that you can lay down to guide this.
And some of the things that we report on are very hard to avoid awful images. I mean, wars, conflicts, that kind of thing. Who decides what audiences should be seeing?
Well, ultimately editors do, of course, but the who should decide is perhaps the better question. I'm opposed to any form of censoring things simply because they are graphic imagery. Some of the graphic imagery is necessary in order to illustrate what's going on. And certainly it's just as unethical to sanitize wars as it is to show the really raw side of them.
Right.
There are some philosophical arguments about making war horrible, because that people are less likely to go to war if it's horrible.
Right, I see the point you're making there. Ladies, let me start with you, Jessica. How do violent images affect audiences? And should we be thinking about, for example, the New York Times coverage, how that impacted on the families of those victims who were being shown?
That's a great question. And just as some background, I could share that I had a great team that did a lot of research for this book. And one of the very interesting and surprising things that we learned is that despite the widespread assumption that the news is frequently showing bodies, we can often complain that the news media are awash in these morbid images. But while doing the research, carefully tracking how often these images actually appear, we found that they are extremely rare. And you could estimate that they are about less than 1% of the images are showing a dead victim. So these so-called graphic images are actually very rare despite the daily onslaught of news stories about death.
So you're actually saying the perception that we're seeing more dead people in news media is actually not entirely correct?
It's actually something that feels common, and indeed the headlines and the newscasts are focused on death every day. It's considered universally the most important news event, but the pictures of the dead themselves are actually extremely rare.
Chanju, did it surprise you when the New York Times chose to put pictures of victims who'd been killed whilst the incident was still ongoing? I think that was one of the main things that really drew criticism.
Yeah, so to be completely honest, it did not surprise me at all, because we do tend to find the way that incidents such as these are treated in the Western media when they're happening in Africa, in Asia, basically in the non-Western world. The victims aren't treated with the same level of respect as they would be in the US or.
Why? Why do you say that?
I think it's generally comes down to the fact that people in Africa or elsewhere are seen as the other. They're seen as not the same as the Western people.
Well, I mean, can I just play devil's advocate and say a lot of these horrible events and terror attacks take place in those countries. So that is why perhaps there are more pictures from that part of the world.
And well, if we think back to the Tunisia attack was it 2015, I don't recall seeing a single image of a dead tit bloodied while the event was going on, even though there was live coverage while the event was going on. So when you compare that, which is happening it's happening in Africa, but to a majoritarily white population, then this, which is happening in Kenya, to a majority black population, the images were of the black people slumped over, even though there were white victims. It's just contradictory to say that actually, yeah, we do treat the incidents the same, whether the victims are white or whether they're black.
What do you think about that? Because the New York Times put out a statement afterwards saying, look, we know it was a horrific event, but we treat all events the same. Some of the criticism is that we are happier to depict, or the Western media is happy to depict horrific events from parts of the world which are seen as being very far away and very different to us because we don't subscribe the same value on their lives. I mean, do you agree with that?
I would agree with what Jessica says, that the imagery now is actually rarer than it's been in the past. The studies that I've done have gone back to the American Civil War, where huge numbers of photographs were used, which contained massive graphic imagery of troops on both sides, Confederate and Union, some of them badly mutilated or decomposing. And even, and obviously the Vietnam War portrayed graphic violence all the time. I use a lot of that imagery in the lectures I give.
And the pictures from the Vietnam War actually changed people's opinions.
Of course,
about
the Vietnam War was won in the living rooms of America, not in Southeast Asia, is the favourite phrase.
But is it fair to say that, given that the pictures from that era were less widely disseminated? Now these pictures can go everywhere, right? So maybe now we're more sensitive about them.
There was no social media, but those images were extremely widely disseminated. They were in all Western media, and they depicted significant numbers of American casualties as well as Vietnamese casualties. And even the Falklands War, which was a heavily censored war, it showed some very, very graphic imagery of wounded and dead soldiers. And as I mentioned, that war was actually censored.
Paddy, what do you think about this accusation that we're more likely to see horrific images coming from African countries than in the West?
I don't know. I think maybe we're reading too much into this. I think on this occasion, the bureau chief in East Africa got it wrong for the New York Times. I think...
you don't think those pictures should have been published?
I don't think they should have been published because I don't think we learnt very much from them. Seeing someone slumped over their breakfast or over their laptop whilst working does nothing. I think editors have got a really difficult job to do. Most newspapers, their line is, like my newspaper, The Independent, they said their line is that sometimes it is necessary to show injury and death to bring home the horror. But it has to be done tastefully and in a dignified way. And I think that you get a kind of an amount of lifelines or tokens to do that. If we keep pushing it out to the media, we just become desensitized to it. I think society has gone completely the wrong way now, that we have lost touch with the fragility of life. And I think we're so terrified of mortality that any distressing scene we look at now is kind of, everyone's up in uproar. But I don't think... Obviously, these things do happen more in those parts of the world.
It's a good point you raise about desensitizing. Jessica, as far as news pictures in the media go, what is the line between sensationalism and pictures that actually inform? And do we run the risk of desensitizing an audience to a terrible event that's taken place?
Well, that's a great question about the concern that I think is really focused on whether there will be moral disengagement because of exposure to these images. But there are many cases when we know that the opposite has happened, that we know that an image, for example, of the Syrian boy washed up on the beach, that stoked a lot of outrage. It was a goat to outrage. And a lot of people rightfully point out that sometimes these images can inspire us to act, inspire charitable giving, and you can't predict which one is going to have which effect. And to go back to the question of race, we found some very surprising patterns there too, because although the media are often criticized for preferring to show the bodies of Black or brown victims and almost never showing the white ones, when we investigated, we found the exact opposite. This is among television and newspapers and online news media. The vast majority of the graphic images showing dead bodies were actually white bodies. And I can tell you that over the last several decades, these tend to be victims in Bosnia, Kosovo, Russia.
What do you say to that, Chanju, that actually there are more white people shown dead in the media than Black?
I think looking at that, yes, empirically there are more white people being shown, but when you look at the proportions in terms of actually, are we seeing the positive stories of Black people? Are we seeing images of Black people or Africans when something good happens? No, we don't see that. So then that's why it's so...
I was just going to ask, does that mean that... Are you saying we should see fewer of those pictures of African suffering, for example? I mean, in the conflicts that are taking place, in the food shortages that some of them suffer, should we not be showing those pictures?
So we should be showing these pictures to understand what's actually going on, but at the same time, we should also be showing the good news. We should be showing the positive stories that are going on, because what we're finding is that the rhetoric around Africa tends to fall around the
Right.
images of violence that we see, the images of poverty. And because of that, that's why there's so much uproar, so much horror. So I've actually lived in Kenya, I've had family in Kenya, and so many people were against this because of the fact that the West never shows or celebrates the richness of the country, the success stories of the country, but then it goes ahead and shows the dead bodies of Kenyan citizens who were in the middle of an attack. Their families weren't told about their deaths. This is just disgraceful, basically.
I mean, the timing of that did cause a lot of problems for people. And so it brings me back to this question about sensationalism, and that's something that you touched on. I know that editors make decisions about what they run, and I know they have a very difficult job. At the same time, they have to sell papers. And so is there a fine line? I mean, are we getting it right?
I think there's a really big difference between the revelation of wickedness and the kind of tasteless exhibition of the same thing. And I think editors are getting it right. I think they're terrified also of getting it wrong. I really commend the editor of the New York Times for having the bravery to do this. I just think that it was just a wasted opportunity. We didn't learn anything from it. The Alan Kurdi picture was what the world needed to see at that time. You know,
this was a little toddler washed up, his body on the beach, and there was no blood, no gore.
No.
It was a very still,
it's very tasteful
picture.
Yeah.
But it raised a lot of questions about what had led to that event. So, in cases like that, can we justify
yes,
using
it's
those
highly
pictures?
in context. Similarly, the Michael Burke documentary, which triggered Live Aid,
famine,
That's right.
the images there were not directly of warfare, although they were a result of it, and it had an extremely positive effect.
I remember those pictures, and they had a massive impact because we hadn't really seen pictures like that before.
No, and no one predicted what the outcome of it would be either. And the problem with this kind of imagery, particularly when it's live or almost live, instant 24-hour rolling news, is the decision to film it or not film it is taken within a split second, and the consequences emerge maybe hours later or maybe even days later. So it's difficult to determine whether it was right to do this at the time.
But those images now, and not to sound tasteless, but there is a generation who are very familiar with those images because we see images like that every day. And Chanju makes the point that we see pictures a lot of African suffering. So are we becoming desensitized?
I wouldn't think it would have any kind of desensitizing effect at all. I would think that would be rather extreme. If you were sort of watching this day in, day out as some kind of voyeurism, perhaps it would. But these are news
NGOs
stories.
getting charities are very aware of this giving fatigue when they're constantly asking for money for various disasters, and people eventually stop listening, not because they're bad people, but because they're getting the same information. Is that not the same with pictures?
I think so. I've got so many friends who are so ashamed to say to me, actually, I don't read the paper anymore, and I don't watch the news anymore. It's that ostrich syndrome, bury your head in the sand, hope it'll just blow over. It won't, unfortunately. And it is just, it's kind of post-Murdoch era. Don McCullum was cast aside as some sort of social pariah, and his life's work of trying to show us what we needed to see was no longer important, and we just wanted to see things of leisure and travel and lifestyle. And this is the kind of new culture we're in. I think it's very important to be reminded and taken out of our comfort zone sometimes. And I hope that lots of editors continue to do that.
Jessica, is this an issue? If we see too many of these kind of gory images, they stop having the same impact on audiences?
I think because these images are so rare that actually the problem might be that they are too rare. If we consider that news is supposed to communicate the most important events, certainly death is one of those very important events, then we have to weigh the fact that we are asking the news media to communicate about death using words but not pictures. And that has significant consequences because words are not substitute for pictures. They are not interchangeable. pictures communicate very different things, and they're very different ways of knowing and learning about the world.
But is there evidence that using graphic pictures actually changes people's minds?
We know that we're visual creatures and that pictures have very different effects on our brains. They have a larger effect because we pay more attention to them, we remember them better, and they also have a stronger influence on our perception and judgment. So in many ways, yes, pictures are more powerful, and that's why we fight over them and when they should be used.
I mean, Chanju, do you agree with that? Because you're saying that there are too many pictures showing negativities, and therefore people become desensitized to what's going on in certain countries.
Yeah, I think that one of the main issues is that we've been desensitized to violence against Black people. So whether that is, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, and all these images of police brutality, or whether that's violence in Africa, the fact that in the UK we have the term black on black violence, whereas we never refer to white on white violence. This is the rhetoric that is making the issue more, like, just aggravating the situation. So yes, we might need to see these images sometimes, but when we're talking about this demographic, when we're talking about Black people, this is the only image that we're seeing. And that's why it's so devastating, because actually we're not listening to this individual stories. We don't know who those two people that the New York Times published are. We don't hear about their stories. There's no follow-up. We don't actually understand what these people's stories are. And the focus is just, okay, we need a shocking image for the time being, but there's never any follow-up. There's never any assistance or help or opportunity to give people the narrative.
In this specific example of the New York Times coverage, this was a terror attack carried out by the AlShabaab group, or certainly they claimed responsibility. Do those pictures, as horrific as they are, does that not increase the momentum of the international community to help Kenya deal with AlShabaab? Does it not have that kind of positive outcome?
I don't think that it has had that outcome, to be honest. I haven't seen any resulting
So there was no worth in those pictures at all?
No, I don't think there was any worth in those pictures, and especially because they were published in the time that they were. I think that images, they could have shown so many different images, and they don't need to show dead bodies for people to believe that people died.
I mean, this is a good point. You don't have to see a dead body to know that people have died in it.
There's a significant counter-argument on desensitization from both sides, in fact, because going back to the Vietnam War again, the Vietnam War was, contrary to a lot of people's views, it was originally popular. And the constant imagery beamed into people's living rooms contributed greatly to the anti-war movement.
It changed popular opinion.
And similarly, the first Gulf War, the concept of embed reporters came back in, embedded with the troops, and that was some of the theory there was that the lieutenants and captains of the Vietnam War were the colonels and generals in the Gulf War, and the military themselves took the view that the whole purpose of having embedded reporting was to effectively to censor some of those images. That certainly both the military and the opposite view, if we can say that, take the view that rather than desensitize, the constant exposure to this makes people more acutely sensitive.
Okay.
We've even got examples where we have what might be called secondary post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right. Last question to you, Paddy. Yeah. Do you think, given the huge amount of images that we are now free to see on social media, on digital, 24-hour TV stations, do you think we're going to see more pushback against particularly graphic images?
I don't think so. I think we're going to see a period of creativity, perhaps from photojournalists. Certainly myself, I was in Indonesia in the autumn last year, in Perumnas, Balaroa, the epicenter of the tsunami and earthquake. And as a photojournalist, I had two options. I could show the death that was there with every swing shovel that went in, excavating out. There were bodies protruding out of every single bucket load. I could have taken that picture. Or I could try and use my creativity and show something that was potentially more powerful. And I opted to show body bags and the flies that were laying eggs on the zips. And it was a really powerful picture, had far more impact. So I think we're going to see this real period of creativity. I don't think we're going to see lots and lots of death in our media.
Does it affect you when you take these pictures?
It's difficult. I don't think a normal human brain is meant to see this all the time. And, this is my job, but I feel compelled to hold the world to account for what I see. And that's my job. It's not my job to censor the media.
Paddy, thank you. And thank you to all of my guests. A really fascinating discussion there. And thank you for watching. If you have any comments on this show, we're on Twitter at TRT World, #Roundtable. See you next time.